My name is Julian. I'm 34 years old. And 3 days ago, I watched my own hands pack 52 identical blue binders into a cardboard box while the man I called my father for 3 decades drank single malt scotch in the next room. The air in my father's study always smelled of beeswax, old paper, and a faint metallic trace of fountain pen ink. It was a smell I used to associate with safety, with the quiet dignity of a life built on precision. For 8 years, I had run the restoration department of Vance & Sons Antiquities, a boutique firm in Boston that specialized in recovering and verifying lost colonial-era documents. I knew the texture of 200-year-old vellum. I knew the exact weight of authentic iron gall ink. I knew how to spot a lie written on paper. What I didn't know was that my entire existence was the forgery. It began with a minor tremor in my right hand. Nothing dramatic, just a slight, annoying vibration when I held a scalpel to scrape away centuries-old grime from a shipping manifest. But then came the numbness in my left leg, a subtle dragging that made the polished hardwood floors of the gallery feel like walking through wet sand. When the diagnosis came down, a progressive, aggressive form of multiple sclerosis, the neurologist sat me down and handed me a list of clinical trials. "There's a new monoclonal antibody trial at Mass General," she had said, her voice soft but urgent. "It's showing incredible success in halting progression, but it's highly selective. They screen for specific genetic markers to ensure there's no predisposition to adverse pulmonary reactions. We need your parents' genetic profiles, or at least a rapid DNA sequencing from you and your immediate family." I hadn't worried. My father, Arthur Vance, was a man of absolute order. He kept meticulous records of everything. Tax returns from 1984, the original blueprints of our family home, even the immunization cards from my childhood. When I asked him for a simple cheek swab, he didn't blink. He merely nodded, his gray eyes steady behind his gold-rimmed spectacles, and said, "Of course, Julian, whatever the doctors need." 2 weeks later, the clinical trial coordinator, a woman named Dr. Aris, called me into her office. She didn't have the folder open. It sat on her desk, thick and ominous like a stone. "Julian," she began, and the way she said my name, not Mr. Vance, but Julian with a terrible, heavy pity made my stomach drop. "We ran the comparative sequencing. We had to run it 3 times, because we assumed there was a laboratory contamination. Is there an issue with my eligibility?" I asked, my fingers tightening around the edge of her mahogany desk. The wood was cold. "You aren't eligible for this specific trial," she said quietly. "But that's not why I called you in. Julian, the DNA sample submitted by Arthur Vance has a 0% probability of paternal match. Furthermore, we ran a standard familial search to see if there was a maternal connection through any archival databases. There is no maternal match to Eleanor Vance either." I stared at her. The air in the room felt thick, hard to breathe. That's impossible. I have my birth certificate. I have photos of my mother in the hospital holding me." "I'm sure you do," Dr. Aris said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She pushed a sheet of paper toward me. "But genetically, you do not share a single strand of DNA with the people who raised you. And there's something else. When we ran your markers through the National Donor Registry to find a bone marrow or stem cell match for your future treatment, we flagged a partial match, a very close one. A sibling." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't have a sibling. I was an only child. My mother, Eleanor, had died of breast cancer when I was 12, leaving Arthur and me in a silent, echoing house. "Who?" I whispered. "His name is Julian Vance," Dr. Aris said. She didn't look at me as she spoke the words. She let them hang in the sterile, fluorescent light of the clinic. "What did you say?" "There is a man registered in the state of New York. Same name, same birth date. Julian Vance. His genetic profile is an identical twin match to yours. But Julian, he has been registered in the state's ward system since he was 4 years old. He is currently residing in a state-assisted care facility in upstate New York, suffering from severe cognitive and physical developmental delays." The room began to spin. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. I looked down at my trembling right hand. The hand that had spent a decade restoring history, meticulously piecing together the broken fragments of other people's lives. My name wasn't just my name. It was a stolen coat. I left the clinic without my coat, despite the bitter Boston October wind. I drove straight to my father's estate in Concord. I didn't knock. I let myself in with my key, the heavy brass turning in the lock with a familiar, sickening click. Arthur was in his study, sitting in his leather wingback chair, a copy of an auction catalog open on his lap. He looked up, his expression perfectly serene, his silver hair immaculate. "Julian," he said, noting my pale face, the breath coming in ragged gasps. "You look unwell. Is it the progression? Who am I, Arthur?" The catalog didn't fall from his hands. He didn't flinch. He simply closed the booklet, placed it carefully on the side table next to his scotch, and looked at me with a cold, analytical curiosity that made my blood run like ice. "Ah," he murmured, adjusting his glasses. "I see the hospital called." The grandfather clock in the corner of Arthur's study chimed once, a deep resonant copper note that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my shoes. "Sit down, Julian," Arthur said. His voice had the flat, unbothered cadence of a professor about to explain a difficult but ultimately logical mathematical equation. "You are hyperventilating. It is bad for your neurological state." "Tell me," I whispered. My knees felt hollow, as if the bones had been replaced with papier-mâché. I didn't sit. I leaned against the heavy oak bookshelf, my fingers digging into the leather spines of rare books I had spent years preserving. Who was the man in New York? Why does he have my name? Why does he have my face? Arthur took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. He looked at the amber liquid swirling against the crystal glass before setting it down on a leather coaster. 34 years ago, your mother and I went to an experimental fertility clinic in Switzerland. Eleanor desperately wanted a child, but her body was failing her. The treatments were aggressive, highly unregulated, and ultimately complicated. You were born in a private clinic near Geneva, twins. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recalled the details, not with warmth or sorrow, but with the detached precision of an archivist. You were born healthy, he continued. Your brother, whom we also named Julian, in a brief fit of sentimentality before we understood the reality, was not. He suffered severe oxygen deprivation during a prolonged, catastrophic labor. By the time he was a year old, it was clear he would never walk, never speak, never have a cognitive capacity beyond that of a toddler. He was a broken vessel, Julian. A cold, greasy sweat broke out across my forehead. So you discarded him? We made a rational decision, Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming firmer, more defensive. Eleanor was already showing the early signs of the cancer that eventually took her. We did not have the emotional or physical bandwidth to raise a child who would require 24-hour clinical care. We returned to the United States. We placed the other Julian in a private, highly reputable care facility in New York. We paid for it through a blind trust to avoid public scrutiny. We kept you. We gave you his name on the official state registries here in Massachusetts because the Swiss paperwork was a logistical nightmare to amend, and we wanted a clean, perfect slate. A perfect slate, I repeated. The words tasted like ash. You cloned my identity to cover up the fact that you abandoned your disabled son. We saved you, Arthur snapped, his composure cracking for a fraction of a second, revealing a glimpse of the tyrannical perfectionist beneath. We poured every resource, every ounce of our ambition, into making you a success. I trained you myself. I gave you a career, a legacy, a name that means something in this industry. Do you think you would be the head of Restoration at Vance and Sons if you were just some charity case? I made you. But I'm not a Vance, I said, the realization finally crashing through the shock, tearing a ragged hole in my chest. Genetically, you said you went to a clinic. Whose DNA did you use? Arthur looked away then, his gaze drifting to the dark window overlooking the manicured lawn. Eleanor's eggs were non-viable. We used an anonymous donor, and my own, well, the clinic made an error. They used a donor profile for the paternal side as well. I didn't find out until you were 5 years old, during a routine medical screening. By then, Eleanor was too sick, and the lie was already too large to dismantle. You are the product of two nameless strangers in a Swiss laboratory, Julian. You have no claim to this family, no claim to this blood. He stood up, smoothing the front of his cashmere sweater, and walked over to his desk. He picked up a thick manila envelope and held it out to me. This contains a severance agreement, Arthur said, his voice returning to its cool, clinical baseline, and a non-disclosure contract. You will resign from the firm immediately. I cannot have a restoration director whose medical history and genetic illegitimacy could bring scandal to our clients' acquisitions. I have set up a modest annuity for you, enough to cover your basic medical expenses for the next few years. In exchange, you will sign these, leave Boston, and never associate yourself with the Vance name again. I stared at the envelope in his hand. It was the exact same weight as the historical documents we authenticated at the shop. A piece of paper designed to make a lie look like the absolute truth. And if I don't sign? I asked. Arthur smiled, a small, humorless twitch of his lips. Then I will cut off the funding. For the trust in New York, the facility your brother lives in is expensive. Without my monthly payments, he will be transferred to a state-run ward, a warehouse for the forgotten Julian. He won't survive a year there. His lungs are already failing. Sign the papers, take the annuity, and let us both pretend this conversation never happened. I looked at my hand, the tremor stronger now, a visible shaking that I couldn't control. I looked at the man who had tucked me into bed, who had taught me how to read old script, who had held my hand at my mother's funeral. He wasn't my father. He was a collector who had found a flaw in his favorite piece, and now he was throwing it in the trash. I didn't take the envelope. I turned around, my dragging left leg scraping against the Persian rug, and walked out of the study, out of the house, and into the dark, freezing rain. The lock on my apartment door didn't turn. I stood in the dimly lit hallway of my brick building in South End, the key heavy and useless in my hand. I tried again, twisting hard until the brass bit into my thumb, but the cylinder remained frozen. Then I saw the small white sticker affixed to the wood, just above the deadbolt. Property of Vance & Sons Antiquities. Access restricted. Arthur hadn't even waited for the rain to stop. The apartment was leased under the corporate umbrella of the gallery, OR, tax write-off, Arthur had called it when I moved in, a sign of his generosity. In reality, it was just another leash. Within 3 hours of leaving his study, my corporate credit card had been deactivated, my gallery email account deleted, and my personal bank account, which was tied to the firm's credit union, frozen pending. Administrative review. I had $42 in my wallet, a half-empty pack of mints, and a body that was slowly turning against itself. I took the stairs down to the alley behind the building, my left leg dragging with a heavy, scraping sound that seemed to echo off the damp brick walls. The rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing mist that clung to my eyelashes and blurred the yellow halo of the streetlights. I found a diner 3 blocks away, a place with cracked vinyl booths that smelled of burnt grease and cheap floor wax. I sat in the back corner, ordering a black coffee I couldn't afford to waste, and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped it twice onto the laminate table. When I finally managed to open my contacts, I realized the depth of my isolation. Every friend I had was connected to the gallery. Every appraiser, every restorer, every auctioneer, they all answered to Arthur. If I called them, they would already know. Arthur's network was a web, and I had just been swept out of it like a stray piece of dust. By midnight, the stress had triggered a massive neurological flare-up. A sharp electric heat began to crawl up my spine, radiating outward until my ribs felt bound by iron bands. The diner waitress, a tired woman with a name tag that read Marnie, looked at me with concern as she wiped down the adjacent table. "You okay, hun? You look a little green." "I'm fine," I tried to say, but my jaw felt stiff, the muscles refusing to coordinate. The words came out slurred, thick, like I had a mouthful of wet clay. I stood up to leave, but the moment my weight shifted to my left foot, my knee buckled completely. There was no pain, just an absolute, terrifying absence of communication between my brain and my leg. I collapsed sideways, my shoulder slamming into the edge of the booth before I hit the linoleum floor. The diner went quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. "Oh my God. Someone call 911. Marnie screamed, her voice sounding thin and distant, as if she were shouting down a long cardboard tube. "No," I gasped, my face pressed against the cold, greasy floor. The smell of ammonia and old syrup was overwhelming. "No ambulance, please, just help me sit." 2 men from a corner booth hoisted me up, dragging my dead weight back onto the vinyl seat. I sat there sweating, my chest heaving, utterly humiliated as the entire diner stared at the 34-year-old man who couldn't even stand. On his own 2 feet, I felt stripped bare, a fraud who had been exposed not just to his family, but to the world. I was Julian Vance, master restorer, reduced to a heap on a diner floor, with no home, no family, and a body that was rapidly becoming a prison. I pulled my phone out one last time. With faltering fingers, I opened the digital wallet where I kept scans of personal documents. I scrolled past the forged birth certificate, past the diplomas, until I found a scanned image of a handwritten letter my mother, Eleanor, had left me in her safety deposit box before she died. I had kept it as a keepsake, but I had never looked at the envelope's back. The scan of the back of the envelope showed a faint, faded purple stamp from a post office in a small town called Beacon, New York, and beneath it, written in her hurried, elegant script, a script she only used when she was anxious, was a set of coordinates, and a single name, Sister Beatrice, St. Jude's Home. My mother had known. She had left me a breadcrumb 22 years ago, knowing that one day the lacquer on Arthur's perfect life would begin to crack. I looked down at my trembling legs. I had $42, a failing body, and a twin brother in a care facility 5 hours away who was being used as a hostage to keep me silent. But as I stared at the purple stamp on my phone screen, the despair in my chest began to harden into something else, something cold, sharp, and dangerous. Arthur had spent my entire life teaching me how to find the truth hidden beneath layers of old paint and forged signatures. He had trained his own executioner. The bus to Beacon, New York smelled of diesel fumes and wet wool. I sat in the last row, my forehead pressed against the vibrating glass of the window, watching the Massachusetts state line dissolve into a bleak stretch of gray highway. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of electric pain up my spine, but the iron band around my ribs had begun to loosen. My body was giving me a temporary reprieve, a fragile window of clarity, and I couldn't afford to waste a single second of it. I arrived in Beacon at dawn. The town was nestled against the Hudson River, a quiet enclave of old brick factories, and steep hills coated in a thick layer of autumn mist. St. Jude's, home for exceptional care, sat on the northern edge of the town, surrounded by a high wrought iron fence that had rusted to a dull, flaking orange. Walking up the gravel driveway was an exercise in pure willpower. My left leg still dragged, tracing a faint, shallow groove in the small stones. The main building was a massive Victorian structure made of dark river stone, its heavy slate roof glistening with morning dew. It looked more like a fortress than a sanctuary. I pushed through the heavy oak front doors. The interior didn't smell like a hospital. It smelled of lavender soap, boiled cabbage, and old floor wax. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock and the faint, high-pitched hum of the industrial floor buffer from a far corridor. "Can I help you?" An elderly nun in a traditional gray habit sat behind a glass partition. Her face was a map of deep lines, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and completely alert. Her desk was immaculate, save for a small wooden rosary and a brass nameplate that read, Sister Beatrice. My breath caught in my throat. The breadcrumb was real. "Sister Beatrice," I said, my voice sounding raspy from the long bus ride. "My name is Julian." She looked up, her gaze shifting from my face to my hands, which were gripping the edge of the wooden counter to steady my tremors. She paused, her eyes widening by a fraction of a millimeter as she studied the symmetry of my jaw, the shape of my brow, the exact shade of gray in my eyes. "You look just like him," she whispered, her voice dropping to a low, reverent murmur. "But your eyes have the light in them. You know who I am?" I asked, leaning closer to the glass. "I know who you should be," she said, sliding open the glass partition. She stood up, her small frame slightly stooped with age, and stepped out into the hallway. "Eleanor told me you might come one day. She came here 2 months before she passed away. She was very weak, Julian. She wept right here in this hallway. She told me she had committed a sin that would follow her to the grave. She had allowed her husband to divide a soul. My brother," I said, the word feeling heavy and foreign on my tongue. "Is he here?" Sister Beatrice didn't answer right away. She turned and walked down the long sunlit corridor, signaling for me to follow. "Arthur Vance is a powerful man, Julian. For 30 years, he has sent a check every month through a shell company in Delaware. The contract states that if anyone from the Vance family ever contacts this facility, or if the other boy's existence is leaked to the media, the trust is liquidated instantly. He kept your brother here like a painting stored in a vault. He threatened to cut off the funding if I didn't disappear," I said, my chest tightening. "He's using my brother's life to buy my silence." "Arthur Vance thinks money is the only currency that matters," Sister Beatrice said, stopping in front of a heavy door at the end of the hall. The nameplate on the door read, Room 114, but he forgets that some people cannot be bought. "Follow me." She unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was bathed in the soft golden light of the morning sun. A single bed sat in the center, surrounded by medical monitors that beeped in a slow, comforting rhythm. Sitting in a specialized wheelchair near the window was a young man. He was wearing a soft blue flannel shirt. His head was tilted slightly to the left, his hands curled inward against his chest. But as the door creaked open, he turned his head toward us. It was like looking into a cracked, distorted mirror. He had my nose. He had my high cheekbones. He had the exact same silver-flecked gray eyes, but where my face was tight with the stress and exhaustion of 34 years of performance. His face was entirely smooth, untouched by the complexities of the world. "Julian," Sister Beatrice said softly, walking over to him and gently smoothing down his hair. "Look who is here! Someone has come to see you." The man in the chair let out a low, soft hum, a sound that wasn't a word but a pure, unadulterated expression of recognition. His gray eyes locked onto mine. He didn't see a stranger. He didn't see a threat. He raised his right hand, a hand that trembled with the exact same frequency, the exact same rhythm as my own. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone. I didn't feel like a forgery. I felt a strange, profound connection that bypassed logic, bypassed science, bypassed the lies of Arthur Vance. "He knows you," Sister Beatrice whispered, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. "He has survived all these years because he was waiting for you." I walked across the room, my dragging leg forgotten, and sank to my knees beside his chair. I reached out and took his trembling hand in mine. His skin was warm, his grip surprisingly firm. "I'm here," I whispered, the tears finally breaking through, hot and fast against my cheeks. "I'm here, Julian." As our hands locked together, I noticed something small tucked into the pocket of his flannel shirt. It was an old yellowed piece of paper, folded into a tight square. Sister Beatrice saw my gaze. Eleanor hid that in his belongings the day they brought him here. She told me never to let Arthur see it. She said it was the only thing that could ever set both of her boys free. The paper was so brittle it felt like dried birch bark beneath my fingertips. I sat on the edge of my brother's small bed, my knees nearly touching his wheelchair, and slowly unfolded the square. The scent of lavender soap from Julian's flannel shirt filled the narrow space between us. He watched me, his gray eyes tracking the movement of my hands, letting out another soft, rhythmic hum that sounded like a low vibration in his chest. It wasn't a letter. It was an original, hand-drawn architectural map of the Vance & Sons main vault in Boston, dated May 14th, 1991. My mother had drawn it. I recognized the meticulous, fine lines she used when she drafted garden designs. But this was different. It was a schematic of the basement floor, specifically highlighting a double-walled partition behind the Restoration Lab's dry storage cabinet. Written in her small, precise script along the margin were 5 numbers, 84209, and beneath them a single devastating sentence. Arthur's true ledger, the original Swiss intake records, and the biological identity of the donor. Forgive me, Julian. I was too weak to stop him. My breath hitched. The donor. The biological father Arthur claimed was an anonymous, error-ridden mistake in a Swiss lab. If my mother had hidden the original records, it meant Arthur had lied about that too. He hadn't just cloned my identity. He had erased our actual heritage to ensure we could never claim anything outside of his strict control. She tried to go back for it, Sister Beatrice said, standing near the door with her hands tucked into her sleeves. A month before she became too ill to travel, Eleanor came here and told me she was going to retrieve the documents. She wanted to bring Julian, your brother, to a specialized clinic in Switzerland that had offered to help him. But Arthur found out she was looking into the accounts. He moved her to a private hospice wing, cut off her access to the outside world, and, well, she never left. I looked at Julian. He was watching the paper in my hands. Then he reached out, his curled fingers gently tapping the side of my wrist. His touch was light, but it felt like an electric current. "We're going to finish what she started," I whispered to him. For the next 3 weeks, St. Jude's became my sanctuary and my prison. With no money and a body that required careful management, I worked. I couldn't return to Boston, so I offered my skills to the home. In the basement of the convent, Sister Beatrice showed me a damp room filled with centuries-old parish ledgers, historical property deeds from the Hudson Valley, and damaged Bibles dating back to the Revolutionary. "War, they are rotting," she said simply. "If you can save them, you can stay. We will cover your food and your medicine." I threw myself into the work. It was a different kind of restoration. In Boston, I had restored for profit. working under the cold, demanding gaze of wealthy collectors who wanted their investments to look pristine. Here I restored for survival. I set up a makeshift lab on a long wooden folding table. I used distilled water, a soft camel hair brush, and wheat starch paste I mixed myself over a hot plate. Day after day I sat in the quiet basement, carefully flattening pages, repairing tears with Japanese tissue paper, and binding loose signatures back into their leather spines. Every afternoon, Sister Beatrice would wheel Julian down to the basement. At first, I didn't know how to interact with him, but as the days turned into weeks, we found a rhythm. Julian loved the sound of the paper. When I dry cleaned a page with a vulcanized rubber sponge, the soft scritch-scratch sound would make him smile. A wide, lopsided grin that reached his eyes and made him rock slightly in his chair. Started talking to him. I told him about the colonial maps I used to restore. I told him about the smell of Boston in the winter. I told him about our mother. She had a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. Julian, I told him one Tuesday, as I carefully applied paste to the spine of an 1842 register of births, and she always smelled like lilies. Do you remember? Julian looked at me, his head tilted, and let out a soft, clear hum. He reached out and touched my cheek. His hand was steady. My tremor, too, had begun to quiet. The physical therapist at the home, a volunteer named David, had started working with me in the evenings. The daily routine, the absence of Arthur's crushing expectations, and the simple, purposeful work of saving these old books was doing what the expensive Boston neurologist couldn't. My body was finding its footing again. One evening, after Julian had been wheeled back upstairs, I sat at the table looking at the architectural map my mother had drawn. My fingers were warm, the circulation back in my hands. The physical progress was a gift, but I knew it was temporary. Multiple sclerosis was a thief. It would come back for what it left behind. I had a window of strength and I had to use it. I pulled out my phone and looked at the date. The annual Boston Antiquarian Exposition was in 2 weeks. It was the biggest event of the year for Vance and Sons. Arthur would be at the Sheraton Boston Hotel for 3 days, hosting international buyers and showing off his latest acquisitions. The gallery in the South End would be empty, guarded only by a skeleton staff and the automated security system. I looked at my mother's map. The vault combination was 30 years old, but Arthur was a man of habit. He never changed a combination unless there was a breach. To him, the vault was impenetrable. I picked up my phone and made a single phone call to an old colleague, a freelance courier named Marcus, who owed me his career after I authenticated a forged Paul Revere silver bowl that would have ruined him. Julian? Marcus's voice was hushed, terrified. Man, where are you? Arthur told everyone you went on a medical sabbatical in Europe. He said you were unstable. I'm in New York. Marcus, I said, my voice steady, cooler than it had been in months. And I need a favor. I need to know who is patrolling the South End Gallery on the night of November 14th. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Marcus breathing, the hesitation thick in the air. Julian, if Arthur finds out... Arthur is a forgery, Marcus, I said. And I'm about to scrape the paint off. Marcus's voice dropped to a barely audible whisper over the static of the line. The night of the 14th is the opening gala at the Sheraton, Julian. Arthur's got the whole team there. He's showing off the draft of the Sebern 74. Suffolk Resolves he supposedly found in an attic in Maine. The gallery will have exactly one person on site, Leo. My grip tightened on the phone. Leo. He was an older night watchman, a sweet man with bad knees who spent his shifts reading historical biographies and drinking chamomile tea from a thermos. He wouldn't be a threat, but he didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire either. What about the security grid? I asked. Arthur upgraded the exterior cameras last spring, Marcus said, his breathing shallow. But the basement access, the old coal chute door behind the restoration lab, it's still on the analog bypass loop because the brickwork is too damp for the wireless sensors. If you have the key to the iron grate and you know how to sequence the keypad inside the vestibule, you have exactly 90 seconds before the silent alarm pings the central station. I know the sequence, I said. It was the date of the gallery's founding. Arthur's vanity was his only predictable flaw. Thank you, Marcus. Julian, Marcus interrupted before I could hang up. Be careful. Arthur isn't just protecting his business anymore. He's protecting a legacy. If you pull on a thread that unravels him, he won't just fire you. He'll make sure you disappear. He already tried, I said, and ended the call. The next morning, I went up to Julian's room. The autumn sun was sharp and bright, casting long, barred shadows across the linoleum floor. He was sitting in his chair, wearing his favorite blue flannel shirt, looking out at the gravel driveway where a few stray, yellow maple leaves were dancing in the wind. I pulled up a wooden chair and sat close to him. I took his hand. It felt warm, and for the first time his fingers didn't curl inward defensively. They lay relaxed in my palm. "I have to go back to Boston for a few days, Julian," I said softly. He didn't turn his head immediately, but his fingers twitched against mine. A low, questioning hum vibrated in his throat. "I have to get something our mother left for us," I continued, looking into his gray eyes, the eyes that matched my own so perfectly, yet held none of the bitterness I had carried for years. "Arthur took our names. He took our family. He tried to make us both invisible. But I'm going to bring back the proof of who we are. I'm going to make sure he can never threaten you again." Julian slowly turned his face toward me. He stared at me for a long time, his gaze intense, searching my face as if he were reading an old familiar text. Then, with an effort that made his shoulders tense and his jaw tighten, he raised his left hand. He didn't tap my wrist this time. He reached up and gently touched the corner of my eye, brushing away a stray tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "Julian," he whispered. The sound was thick, slurred, and barely louder than the rustle of the wind outside. But it was a name. It was my name. It was his name. It was the first word he had spoken in decades, dragged out of the silence of his mind through sheer beautiful force of will. My heart hammered against my ribs. I leaned my forehead against his shoulder, my shoulders shaking as I wept silently. He rested his hand on the back of my head, a slow, heavy gesture of comfort that felt more ancient and grounded than any building I had ever restored. "Yes," I choked out. "Julian." "We're both Julian." Sister Beatrice stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly against her habit, her face illuminated by a quiet, fierce joy. "He hasn't spoken a word since he was brought here at 4 years old," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not one word, Julian. You are his anchor, and he is mine," I said, straightening up and looking at my brother. The tremor in my hand was completely gone. The strength in my left leg felt solid, the connection restored not by medicine, but by purpose. I wasn't running away anymore. I wasn't a victim of a neurological countdown. I was a brother with a debt to pay to the past, and a future to claw back from the man who had stolen it. Before I left that afternoon, Sister Beatrice handed me a small, heavy iron key. "This is the key to the old coal chute grate," she said. Eleanor gave it to me the last time I saw her. She said she had it copied from Arthur's keyring while he slept. She knew Julian. She knew that one day, one of her boys would need to go home. I took the key. It felt cold and solid, a piece of honest iron forged to open doors that men like Arthur tried to lock forever. The Boston air on the night of November 14th was sharp with the scent of salt, water, and burning heating oil. I stood in the deep shadow of an alleyway across from Vance & Sons Antiquities, watching the brick townhouse that had served as my prison and my paradise for nearly a decade. The building was dark, save for the single amber glow of the security desk in the main foyer. At exactly 8:15 p.m., the front door opened, and Leo, the night watchman, stepped onto the sidewalk. He took a deep breath of the cold air, pulled a wool cap over his ears, and began his foot patrol around the block, a routine he had kept every night at this exact hour for 15 years. I had 90 seconds. I slipped out of the shadows, my left leg moving with a fluid, silent grace that felt like a defiance of my own diagnosis. I reached the back of the building, where the old rusted coal chute sat, half hidden behind a stack of empty wooden shipping crates. The iron key sister Beatrice had given me slid into the padlock with a dull, heavy shuck. I turned it. The rusted mechanism resisted for an agonizing second, then snapped open. I lifted the heavy iron grate, the smell of damp brick, coal dust, and old earth rising from the darkness below. I dropped through the chute, my boots hitting the concrete floor of the cellar with a soft thud. The air was freezing, smelling of limestone and the sweet, chemically scent of the solvents we used in the restoration lab above. I stood in the dark counting my heartbeats, waiting for my eyes to adjust. 10, 20, 30. Moved quickly toward the service door that led into the restoration laboratory. Next to the doorframe, the security keypad's red eye blinked at me in the darkness. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the buttons. 776. The year of the declaration. The year Arthur believed his family's legacy truly began. I pressed the keys. The red light blinked once, twice, and then turned a steady, silent green. The heavy door clicked open. I stepped into the restoration lab. It was exactly as I had left it. My scalpel lay on the work table next to a half-restored map of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The smell of wheat, paste, and beeswax was so familiar it made my chest ache with a sudden, sharp grief. I had loved this work. I had loved the quiet beauty of bringing dead things back to life. But I wasn't here to restore. I was here to uncover. I walked to the back of the lab where a massive, floor-to-ceiling mahogany cabinet held our dry storage supplies. Following my mother's architectural sketch, I reached behind the cabinet's heavy wooden molding. My fingers brushed against a small hidden latch. I pulled it. With a low, heavy groan, the entire back panel of the cabinet slid open, revealing a narrow, stone-walled recess built into the building's foundation. Inside sat a small, green steel lockbox. My hands began to tremble again, not from my disease, but from the sheer suffocating weight of what I was about to do. I looked at the mechanical dial on the front of the box. 184209. I spun the dial, left to 18, right to 42, left to 09. There was a loud metallic clack that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I pulled the lid open. Inside were 3 items. The first was a thick, blue leather ledger, the original Swiss intake records from the clinic in Geneva. I opened it to page 72. There, written in the cold, clinical hand of a Swiss physician, were the details of our birth. But my eyes didn't stop at the medical details. They drifted down to the section labeled Paternal Donor Identification. The name printed on the line was not a stranger's. It was Arthur Vance. Gasp escaped my throat, the sound echoing off the stone walls of the recess. Arthur hadn't used an anonymous donor. Because of an error. He was our biological father. He had lied to me, told me I was the product of 2 nameless strangers, solely to strip away my sense of self-worth and make me believe I had no right to his legacy. He had disowned his disabled son, and then disowned his healthy son's very blood, just to maintain the illusion of his own flawless, self-made narrative. The second item in the box was a medical file. I opened it and saw my mother's name, Eleanor, at the top. It was a neurological report dated 6 months before she died. The diagnosis was unmistakable, familial, early-onset progressive neurological degeneration. My heart stopped. The multiple sclerosis wasn't a random tragic stroke of bad luck. It was a genetic inheritance, passed down from my mother. Arthur had known. He had watched her slip away, and when my own hand began to shake, he didn't see a son who needed help. He saw his wife's flaw repeating itself in his carefully curated heir. He had discarded me because he couldn't bear to look at the truth of his own genetic reality. The third item was a small velvet-covered journal. I opened it to the first page. Written in my mother's elegant faded script were the words, "For my boys, if you are reading this, it means Arthur has succeeded in making you believe you are nothing. Do not believe him. You are the only real things he ever made." I clutched the journal to my chest, the hot tears finally spilling over my eyelashes. "Julian," a voice said from the darkness behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing in the doorway of the restoration lab, his silver hair catching the amber light from the hallway, was Arthur Vance. He was wearing his formal tuxedo, his bow tie slightly undone, his eyes cold and dead behind his spectacles. In his hand, he held a small silver-plated revolver. The silver revolver looked remarkably small in Arthur's hand, almost like a delicate instrument from the restoration table, but its weight in the silence of the room was absolute. "I always knew Eleanor was a romantic," Arthur said, his voice carrying that familiar lecture hall dryness. He stepped into the lab, the leather soles of his dress shoes clicking softly on the hardwood floor. She believed in hidden drawers, secrets in the attic, and eventual redemption. She never understood that in the real world, a lock is only as good as the man who keeps the key. "You lied to me," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I didn't drop the blue ledger or the velvet journal. I held them tightly against my ribs. "You told me I was a stranger's child. You told me my brother was a broken vessel. You had to discard because of a Swiss medical error. But you're our father, Arthur. We are your blood." Arthur stopped a few feet from me. He didn't look at the gun in his hand. He looked at my face, studying it with that same cold, appraising eye he used for unverified 17th century oil paintings. Blood is a biological necessity, Julian, not a moral one, he said quietly. Do you know what happens to a gallery like this if the world finds out that the premier restorer of historic truth is losing his motor skills to a degenerative genetic disease passed down by a family that hid a severely disabled child in a state-run facility? The legacy evaporates. The trust is gone. Our clients don't buy history. They buy certainty. They buy the illusion of timeless, unblemished perfection. And what about Julian? I asked, my voice rising, thick with a sudden, boiling anger. He spoke my name, Arthur. After 30 years of silence in that room, you locked him in. He spoke. He's not a broken vessel. He's your son. For a fraction of a second, Arthur's eyes flickered. A shadow of something old, dark, and deeply buried crossed his face. Perhaps regret. Or perhaps just the frustration of a collector who had failed to completely erase a mistake. A son who cannot feed himself is not an heir, Arthur snapped, his voice losing its academic chill. I did what was necessary to preserve this family's place in the world. I gave you everything. I gave you a name, a life of prestige, a craft, and you throw it away for a handful of yellowed paper and a brother who doesn't even know what year it is. He knows who I am, I said, taking a step toward him. My left leg didn't drag. The iron band around my chest was completely gone, and he knows who you are. Arthur raised the revolver, pointing it directly at my chest. You will put the ledger and the journal back in the box, Julian. You will walk out of here, you will sign the non-disclosure agreement, and you will take the annuity. If you do not, I will call the police. I will report a burglary. A former employee, mentally unstable due to a progressive neurological condition, breaking into the vault. Who do you think the Boston police will believe? The man who funded their charity gala last night? Or a disgraced assistant with shaking hands? I looked down at the gun. I looked at the man who had raised me. The man who had taught me how to recognize a forgery by looking for the tiny, microscopic imperfections that the counterfeiter couldn't help but leave behind. And then I smiled. You're right, Arthur, I said softly. They will believe the man who funded the gala, but they won't have to choose between our words. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my phone. The screen was dark, but the small, green indicator light in the corner was blinking rhythmically. The gallery's local network is analog, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. But the Restoration Lab's diagnostic camera, the one we use to live stream the microscopic cleaning of old documents to our European clients, is connected to the high-speed fiber line. Marcus helped me route the feed. Right now there are 12 major antiquity registrars, 3 journalists from the Boston Globe, and Sister Beatrice in New York watching this room. They heard everything, Arthur. They heard you admit to genetic fraud, to identity theft, and to holding my brother's care trust hostage. Arthur's face went entirely white. His hand, the hand that had never shaken a day in his life, began to tremble. You're bluffing, he whispered, but his eyes darted to the small, cylindrical camera mounted on the ceiling joist above my work table. The tiny blue light on its base was glowing. I don't bluff, Arthur, I said, taking another step forward. You taught me that a restoration is only successful if you remove the dirt down to the very first layer of paint. I'm just cleaning the canvas. From the street outside, the faint, rising wail of a siren broke the silence of the Boston night. The siren grew louder, its high, rhythmic shriek bouncing off the brick alleyways of the South End before suddenly cutting out directly in front of the gallery. Red and blue lights began to dance across the frosted glass windows of the Restoration Lab, painting the white walls and Arthur's pale face in alternating strokes of emergency color. Arthur stood frozen, the silver revolver still half raised, but his arm had gone completely slack. He looked at the ceiling camera, then down at the phone in my hand and finally at me. For the first time in my life, I saw him look old. The immaculate veneer of the legendary Boston patriarch didn't just crack. It shattered, leaving nothing but a terrified, desperate man holding a useless piece of metal. Julian, he stammered, his voice thin, stripped of its professorial weight. We can settle this. The annuity. I can increase it. 5 million. 10. You and your brother can go anywhere in the world. You can get the best care. You still think everything is an acquisition, Arthur, I said, my voice incredibly quiet as the heavy oak. Front doors of the gallery rattled with the force of several fists knocking. You think you can buy back a soul after you've spent 30 years, tearing it in half. The door to the restoration lab burst open. 2 Boston police officers entered, guns drawn, their tactical lights cutting bright, dusty beams through the dim room. Behind them came Marcus, his face pale but his jaw set, pointing toward Arthur. "Drop the weapon! Drop the weapon now!" one of the officers shouted. Arthur didn't fight. He didn't argue. He simply let his fingers loosen, and the silver revolver clattered to the hardwood floor, landing right next to the tray of fine scalpel blades I had used for so many years. An officer moved in quickly, pushing Arthur against the mahogany cabinet, the very cabinet that had hidden my mother's secrets, and pulling his hands behind his back to click the steel, handcuffs into place. As they led him past me, Arthur stopped. He looked at me, his gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a deep, burning resentment. "You've destroyed it," he whispered, his teeth clenched. "The Vance name. The gallery. Everything I built. You've dragged it all into the mud." "No," I said, looking him dead in the eye, feeling a profound, cool peace settle over my chest. "I didn't destroy it, Arthur. I just authenticated it, and it turned out to be a fake." He was let out, his leather shoes dragging on the stairs. Not with the heavy, brave struggle of a man with a failing body, but with the hollow, defeated weight of a criminal who had finally run out of lies. Marcus walked over to me, looking at the blue ledger and the velvet journal still clutched in my hands. "You okay, Julian?" "I am," I said, and for the first time in 8 years, my right hand didn't shake. The tremor had completely stopped, as if the physical burden of carrying Arthur's secrets had finally been lifted from my nervous system. "Thank you, Marcus." "Get out of here," Marcus said, offering a small, sad smile. "The press is going to be outside in 5 minutes. Go back to New York. Go back to your brother." I didn't wait. I took my mother's journal, the Swiss medical records, and the key Sister Beatrice had given me, and I walked out the back coal chute door, slipping into the dark Boston night before the reporters could arrive. The bus ride back to New York was different. The rain had stopped, and the early morning sun was breaking through the autumn clouds, turning the turning leaves of the Berkshire hills into a sea of deep gold and brilliant amber. I didn't feel the electric pain in my spine. I didn't feel the dread of a clock ticking down on my life. When I walked through the doors of St. Jude's the next afternoon, the air smelled of warm bread and lavender. I climbed the stairs to the first floor and walked down the long corridor to room 114. Julian was sitting by the window, the soft light of the afternoon bathing his face. He turned his head as the door clicked open. When he saw me, his entire face lit up. He didn't hum this time. He raised his left hand, his fingers reaching out toward me, and a wide, beautiful smile spread across his face. "Julian," he said again, the word clearer this time, stronger, carrying the weight of a brother who was no longer forgotten. I walked over, sank to my knees, and wrapped my arms around him. The winter of 2026 arrived in upstate New York, not with a sudden storm, but with a slow, quiet freezing that turned the Hudson River into a sheet of slate-gray glass. Vance & Sons Antiquities in Boston was gone. After the live-streamed confession and the subsequent federal investigation, the gallery's assets were liquidated to pay off the massive fraud fines and to settle the civil suit. I filed on behalf of my brother. Arthur Vance pled guilty to multiple counts of identity theft, grand larceny, and the systematic embezzlement of the trust funds meant for Julian's lifelong care. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania, a place where no one cared about the provenance of colonial documents or the pedigree of a family name. But I didn't care about the money. I didn't care about the gallery. With the portion of the trust we recovered, I purchased a small, historic stone cottage, just 3 miles down the road from St. Jude's. The cottage had a wide, sunny room on the ground floor with windows that looked out over a grove of ancient sugar maples. I set up my restoration table there, near the wood-burning stove. Julian moved in with me in the spring. Sister Beatrice had worried about the transition, but Julian thrived. We established a routine that was as steady and peaceful as the ticking of a grandfather clock. Every morning after I helped him dress and eat, I would sit at my table and work on the historical documents that local libraries and private collectors now sent to me from all over the country. The Vance name was gone. I had legally changed my name to Julian Eleanor, taking our mother's first name as our family's new beginning. Julian sat in his specialized reclining chair next to my table, wrapped in his favorite blue flannel blanket. He loved the quiet hum of my small humidifier and the rhythmic, soft scraping of my bone folder against high-grade cotton paper. My own disease hadn't vanished. I still had days when my left leg felt heavy, days when a faint numbness crept into the tips of my fingers. But the progressive, aggressive deterioration the Boston doctors had predicted had slowed to a crawl. My new neurologist called it a remarkable clinical plateau, but I knew the truth. My body was no longer fighting the stress of a stolen life. It had found its alignment. One afternoon, as the first snow of December began to fall in heavy, silent flakes outside the window, I was working on a heavily damaged 1790 diary of a Massachusetts midwife. The pages were thin, water-stained, and fragile as a moth's wing. I was carefully applying a strip of near-invisible Japanese tissue to a torn margin when I felt Julian's gaze on me. I looked up. He was watching my hands. He raised his left arm, an action that took him several seconds of quiet, intense concentration, and pointed his index finger toward the table. "Red," he murmured. His voice was soft, but the word was distinct, cutting through the crackle of the wood stove. I smiled, my chest filling with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. I leaned back in my chair, holding the old diary so he could see the elegant, looping script of a woman who had lived and died 2 centuries ago. December 5th, I read aloud, my voice steady and calm in the quiet room. The snow is deep, but the hearth is warm. Today we brought a healthy boy into the world. His mother named him Christian. He has his father's eyes, but his own strong voice. The world is cold outside, but inside we are entirely safe. Julian let out a long, deep hum, a sound of pure, absolute contentment. He closed his eyes and rested his head against the soft cushion of his chair, a gentle smile touching the corners of his lips. I reached across the gap between our chairs and took his hand. His fingers closed around mine, warm, solid, and incredibly real. We were no longer the secrets hidden in a Swiss laboratory. We were no longer the broken vessels or the perfect duplicates. We were just 2 brothers sitting by a warm fire in a quiet stone house, listening to the snow fall against the glass. We had restored the page. We had uncovered the original ink. And finally, the story was ours to write. Agar Reader Support Initiative. If you or someone you love is navigating the physical, emotional, and psychological challenges of a chronic illness like multiple sclerosis, or searching for support resources for developmental care, you are not alone. The National Multiple Sclerosis Society. Discover local support groups, clinical trial registries, and wellness programs designed to help you regain control of your physical journey. National Society Org, the ARC, an incredible national organization advocating for and serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. thearc.org.